break it down. At the first level, if we look around the world today, there are these three big lumbering gray rhinos. Gray rhinos is not a cute McKinsey term. It's a term of art that refers to high probability risks that are known, right? So known risks of high impact. The three main gray rhinos that command the attention globally are these. There is the conflict in Europe, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's a conflict in the Middle East, tragic in its human dimensions. And then there is the rising strategic competition in Asia. So those big three gray rhinos are affecting the way in which we think about geopolitical risk and also the way companies are having to operate. If you go a level beyond those three gray rhinos though, we are also in a world where we have never seen more conflicts in terms of civil conflicts lasting longer, lasting with more intensity since the end of the Cold War. So below the big three, just the number of conflicts and that sense of the world getting more contested, more heated is actually backed by evidence, by empirical data. Below that level of conflict though, we are also in the year of the elections. And elections can mean two things, continuity or discontinuity. So in a sense, instead of focusing on how many elections are happening in the world, it's worth thinking about those that are going to be discontinuous moments and the effects they may have on your organization and so on. And we've seen a number of key inaugurations take place this week, for example in Taiwan, and then we will see the Indonesian president assume role in October and the Indian elections rounding out. So political uncertainty that comes from elections. But that's the bit that below all of these layers, right, below the big three and below the political risks and the conflicts, we also are just in a different world. The Indian External Affairs Minister Jaishankar talks about the fact that at 1945, there were only 50 states in the world. Today, there are over 200. How can the rules and institutions of that era transfer to this era without changing? And so in that increased number of states, in their increased voice and desire to also shape the rules of the road, that is volatility. Frankly, that's also opportunity for countries that have not always felt that they've had a voice. So, bottom line is that when we think about geopolitical fragmentation or risk, the mind very quickly goes to those three gray rhinos, but if you go down deeper and deeper, you start realizing that this is layer upon layer of complexity. And oh, by the way, introduce along all dimensions of these layers this thing called AI and technology and the way it's transforming each of those dimensions. So, without getting too doom and gloom about it, it is important, I think, to be analytical about how one thinks about geopolitical risk and not limit oneself to just the kind of headline issues. So when we talk to companies then, it's really interesting because they, of course, recognize this. They recognize the world that they're in, but as one CEO said to me, we understand the problem, but we don't have a lot of great solutions. Put another way, when we survey companies and we ask them, what's your top risk? They will rank geopolitical risk as the #1 risk. Incidentally, they rank political risk, as in risk within the four boundaries of the country, as the top emerging risk. Of course, that makes sense in a year of elections. But when you ask them what's your top priority, so not what's your top risk, what's your top priority, it's growth, it's people, it's technology, and very quickly, managing geopolitical risk slides quite quickly down. And I think part of that goes to the fact that it's hard. It's messy, it's difficult to talk about. Forget outside your organization, even inside your own organization, given the emotional and emotive aspects of it. But I would submit that there is a method to the madness that we're seeing companies follow. And if I were to break it down into three categories of bold moves, to use the title from our conference here, that companies are thinking about, it falls into these three. The first is insight, the second is oversight, and then the third is foresight. And I'll just take each of those in turn and give you a flavor of them. When it comes to insight, the typical organization conversation about geopolitics is this. I read something in The Economist or the Financial Times or the Journal. I spoke with my friend who was a former official or a current official. Or we invited a speaker to come in, once or twice a year and he said this. Those days, I think, are decisively over. The sheer velocity with which things are changing, regulations, sanctions, export controls, these conflicts that flare up, requires organizations to have a much steadier way of understanding the world in order to make informed decisions about how to respond to them. So it's not to say that companies don't have those sources of insight, For some companies, they're relying on their government affairs team, their finance team, their security team. But oftentimes those inputs aren't aggregated together very effectively. Some companies have brought in individuals such as a vice chairman to be in their organization as a big policy brain. Or they have set up advisory councils on international affairs. Or they have hired external political risk firms. But there's a limit to how much anyone outside the organization can walk in your shoes. So whether you're a big organization or a smaller one, the fact is that keeping track of geopolitical risk requires, in effect, this concept of having an eye in the sky, a satellite. Now, what does a satellite do? It helps you think about, well, pattern recognition, about weather. A satellite measures infrared light that comes off the Earth and heat to measure weather and predict which way the weather is going to go. Companies are now starting to set up something like that, which you could call a geopolitical risk unit, that is meant to provide that view, right? So developing dashboards about what's coming on export controls, what's coming on sanctions, what's coming in terms of political risks. A satellite also helps you with global positioning, right? The GPS. Where should you operate? What are the risks and returns of being present in a market, right? So all of this capability, increasingly there's a need to develop a steady state team to help leadership understand the world in a sharper and in a more steady state way. So I'd leave you with this image of a satellite and ask yourself, what is your organization's satellite? What is its eye in the sky to help it make sense of the world, in a sense, and aggregate that information into a dashboard that your organization, your board, your senior leadership can use. The second move is around oversight, right? With that insight, you need to be able to then think about, okay, what do we actually need to do differently to both manage the risk and find the opportunity in this much more complex world? And over there are two different levels we can take as examples. I think the first is many companies are realizing that they just need to be much more forensic in how they operate in certain markets. And so the idea of having some form of a risk framework where you talk about the things that are red that you will not do, entities you will not serve, clients you will not seek, because there are legal restrictions, there are sanctions, restrictions, and so on. So there's the red. In some ways, that's pretty clear. There's the green, where you see opportunities and you want to go further as an organization and faster. But the big art, I think, of right now thinking about geopolitics, risk and opportunity is the middle ground. It's the yellow. It's the category of things that, put it this way, are lawful, but potentially awful from a reputational point of view. And so how do you make a judgment when you're in a market of should we work with this entity, should we not, when there's no legal restriction, but when increasingly there may be an expectation from your home government for you to exercise corporate geopolitical responsibility, right? And so as a result, you need to be thinking about how do we want to operate in a particular market. That's just one market though. Another dimension of oversight that we're seeing companies do is fundamentally rethink their business model on 6 different dimensions. Supply chains, where relevant, R&D, tech stack, their people, right, as well, their ownership structures. And so what organizations are thinking about is if we think of these dimensions, they're having to think about some idea or some concept of structurally segmenting their operation so they can be more in a better, more protected place. Let me give you an example from that. When you think of the dimension of technology, many companies have prided themselves on one tech stack, one email stack, right? But increasingly, when they're operating in this more fragmented world with different standards, they're having to create a separate technology stack in one market from another market. And in doing so, of course, they're also risking moving away from being a global organization, the ethos of being global, right? So as a result, some companies have to say, we're going to completely localize our tech stack in this market. We'll keep it hybrid in some other market. Maybe we'll keep one global tech stack in another. Similarly with supply chains, right? Are we going to have a supply chain just for this market? Is it going to be regional, or are we going to maintain a global? So part of the oversight is thinking about these different dimensions where you may need to structurally segment your operations to better protect your position, in a sense. And that again goes to this question of can you remain global? Yes, maybe, but if so, how is the key question. How? Right? So that's a bit around the oversight theme that we're seeing boards and leaders think about it. How do we want to change the operating model? And then the last piece of this is really foresight. Right? For those who recall, exactly a year before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was another very significant political event in Asia. Does anyone recall what that was? Exactly a year to the month before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It was a coup in Myanmar. And overnight, many companies again had to deal with a situation where they had to scale back and exit. Obviously, a year later, some of them had to deal with the ripple effects of Russia and Ukraine. All of this, not to mention COVID and all the shocks from that, have put a really important premium on this concept of looking around the corner. And the framework that we like to offer, and as we think about this, and everyone has their own language of this, is of that of black swans, gray rhinos, and silver linings. I think everyone understands the concept of black swans, right? These are unknown risks of high impact. Gray rhinos, I spoke to that earlier, the known risks of high impact. And then silver linings is that it is not all about geopolitical risk. In this volatility, there is also opportunity. We'll come to that in a second. But fundamentally, if you were to think of helping your organization improve its foresight, looking around the corner, you'd want to be thinking about what are the things and silver linings in that sense are embodied very much so by this country that we're in. One definition of silver linings for companies, global companies today, are what are the new markets where we have geopolitical tailwind to operate, right? What are the markets where there are fundamentals that could really allow us to scale up and make those investments? And Vietnam very quickly comes to the top of that list. We're seeing that. There is a country that, speaking of managing geopolitics and geopolitical currents, is a country that has espoused a policy of bamboo diplomacy. I'll leave that phrase for you to take those fixed principles, like the stem of a bamboo, but on the other hand, you have to be flexible to adapt to different situations and relationships. So Vietnam has that approach, but there's also a market here that for many companies represents a silver lining in a sense, right? So again, when you think about that foresight element, is your organization thinking about the range of things that can go wrong and the openings that could arise, and then how are you positioned for that? So stepping back and just to wrap up, when we think about the title of this conference, bold bright horizons and bold moves, I think I would add a few maybe footnotes to that. I'd probably put next to bright horizons in parentheses and storm clouds. And I think that is the paradoxical mindset that one needs to have in this world today. That yes, there is ample opportunity, there's ample connectivity, there's ample, silver linings flowing from key markets, key technologies, but there are also storm clouds that have a great risk of snuffing that out. So you need to be able to follow essentially a paradox in your mind. It's not one or the other. And then when it comes to bold moves, then the one key takeaway I leave you with for your own organizations is this. How are you doing in terms of your own organization's insight, oversight, and foresight in terms of thinking about these different geopolitical, political, regulatory challenges? And is your organization well prepared, or does it need to make certain further investments to be able to make those, to be able to execute on each of those three components as well? So last thing I'll leave you with is a quote that I think really sums up this very elusive world that we're in a sense. And it's a quote from one of the most famous sort of code breakers from the UK during World War II. His name was Alan Turing. You may have heard his name. And he has this lovely line where he says, we can only see a short distance ahead, but in that we know there is a great deal to be done. And I think that's a feeling that many boards and CEOs and leaders have, which is we don't have perfect clarity. I mean, all of this black swan parameters, it's not a crystal ball. But at the same time, we just have this feeling that there are things that we can do to better protect our position, and there are opportunities that we need to mobilize around. And so again, I'll leave you with insight, oversight, foresight as three words to play around in your head and to maybe assess, audit your own organization's level of preparedness around this. So I'll stop there and thank you again for your time and Shirley for an excellent event.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diaz. I would like to invite you to please remain on stage to receive the token of appreciation from ACCA. And now I would like to invite back on stage Mr.